The sitting is resumed. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to lend support to the bill that has been brought to this chamber, as I think it's important because it provides for the citizens of our country to enjoy the peace and tranquility of their homes at night without the disturbance of the noise from kites. Mr. President, kite flying is great recreation. In fact, as a boy, growing up at Lord Charles Road, we engaged in making and flying kites. We did not have the luxury of the fancy, colorful kites that you see today. We used to make something called a trash bone kite. And we flew them all over the place. Because the Bell Plantation, which was next door to where we lived, had large areas of land, sugarcane. And we made trash bone kites, which we flew, and we enjoyed ourselves in those days. But in those days, Mr. President, kite flying was a daytime activity. We flew kites in the day. I must admit to you, sir, that it's only now that I have come back to Barbados after some years that I find people flying kites in the night. We did not fly kites in the night. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening, you pull down your kite, you wrap up the twine, and you go home. All the time. Wrap up the tail on one side and the twine on the other, and did what you had to do. So now I find that kite flying is a nighttime activity. As if people don't have anything else to do at night. I don't understand it. Mr. President, while supporting the legislation, I have a fundamental concern with our attempts to legislate behavior. Once we begin to go down that road on a frequent basis, we are going to have a slew of legislation, a significant amount of legislation treated with these issues. And it's my understanding that even today, the courts of the land are filled with cases to be heard. And since coming back home, I have been hearing of the backlog, the unavailability of decisions on a variety of things. And if we add new legislation on these behavioral issues to the plate, it seemed to me that we are going to have a significant increase in the number of cases to be heard in the courts. And consequently, we're going to burden the judicial legal system with a significant amount of issues. That being the case, I think it is also important, while this is said not to be a criminal offense as dictated by the legislation, I think it's also important to consider that what we agree to here in terms of legislative provisions and the approval of legislation of this type may not in fact reach the attention or the ears of those who would be affected by it. Many times we make legislation, it is my understanding, but the people who are affected never heard of it. So that the legislation itself does not become, and the penalties associated with it, they do not become a deterrent because the people have not heard about it. I think there's something to be said, Mr. President, for ensuring that what is decided in this honorable chamber becomes common knowledge and is communicated to the society so that those who may be tempted to engage in activities that would be anti this legislation would be discouraged from doing so, because they would be aware that the legislation exists, that is on the book, that this is the penalty, this is the consequences of your behavior. If we do not do that, the legislation may in fact remain just legislation on the books and may have little or no impact or effect on the behavior of those who are currently in contravention of the same. There's also a point made by my fellow senator, Senator Hines, about the challenge of finding the persons who are in fact in contravention of legislation, since many times the persons who are in charge of the kite and where the noise of the kite is heard and found is far removed from each other. And the police may have a problem detecting who really owns this kite, who are the owners of this kite. The sound is 500 meters down the road or somewhere, and the owner is somewhere else. Detecting that person, apprehending the person, charging the person may become a challenge for the police. And so, Mr. President, I think the time has come for us to reconsider legislating behavior and begin to look at our society in terms of the recapturing the values that we once had at the level of the church, in the Sunday school, in the classroom, in the home, in the various groups, the scout group, the girl guides, and the various social groupings that we have, to send a message that individual responsibility and respect for fellow man are still fundamental elements on which this society will prosper. We cannot continue to legislate all behaviors. Otherwise, our law books will be filled with legislation, and the possibility for implementing it may frustrate the very systems that we're putting in place to control it. I believe, therefore, that we must relook the legislation already on the books related to this topic, maybe review it, but we have to be careful not to continue to try to legislate behavior in our country. We need to look for other social, psychological, and strategic initiatives that can help us to get our people to understand that there are things called individual rights and responsibilities that are important for a healthy Barbados. Healthy not only in the context of real health, but healthy in the context of respect for each other. I suffer in my own community of people passing and dropping garbage in front of my house, for example, with scant regard for the fact that people live here and that we're trying to keep our community clean. The people who do this couldn't care less. People burn garbage. The smoke from that garbage affects the ambiance of the community. These are things that should not be. These are things that should not happen if we inculcate in our citizens that sense of responsibility and respect for each other. the time has come, Mr. President, for us to renew our commitment to those fundamental values of personal responsibility, respect for our fellow man, and truly try to see how we as a country can be a model country for the small island developing states. There are many countries that have gone very far in this regard, and we must examine them and see what they're doing that could be helpful to us as we try to build a responsible society with responsible citizenry, versed in civics and social responsibility to each other. It will not be solved, Mr. President, by legislation alone. And while I support this bill as presented today, I wish to caution us as we go forward to do all that we can not to go down the road of trying to legislate human behavior, because we may end up having so much legislation on our books that we cannot police or implement. And therefore, I close with these few words, Mr. President, and I hope that this bill will be considered and approved in spite of the comments that I have made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford. Senator Herod.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I really did not intend to make a contribution today on this non-contentious bill, but I'm very much inspired by all of the comments in this chamber that we made today, and many of them sent me down memory lane as far as rules are concerned, and as opposed to kite pulls and other things that were mentioned. I must admit that kite flying ranks, Mr. President, high amongst many of those traditions in the communities across Barbados in terms of our culture. If I'm permitted, sir, to personify my admiration for kite flying, I would even say it stands toe-to-toe, sir, with finding a perfect Y-shaped clamachari stick, wrapping it with the inner tube of a bicycle, putting some rubber bands and a piece of leather, and making what we refer to as a gutter perk, sir. It stands toe-to-toe with that, sir. And many persons in here know what we used to do to gutter perk. We used to shoot, we use it as a tool to make our personal presence acknowledged to those creatures of God. Obviously, long before the animal protection legislation would have been passed, sir. That's what we used to do to gutter perk. But back to the kite, sir, I recognize down memory lane, remember we used to make 6 stickies. That's the term you use when the kite is made of 6 sticks. 4 stickies, 3 stickies, and 2 stickies, which you could appreciate was really a box kite. And anything below that would really be a plastic bag kite that you run about the community, hoping that it would fly as well, sir. So, sir, I really have an appreciation for that. But I intend, similar to other colleagues, not to be too long on this, because my memory serves me very accurately in terms of what Mr. Brathwaite mentioned, that we didn't really have many resources, so we had to improvise even with the CM kites as well. I remember some persons would reflect on using old bed sheets or new bed sheets and hide them. I personally had to use some VCR tapes, which is just a black roll inside the VCR to make some kite tail as well. And people came to words and blows for kites, sir, because we used to go across in Bornsland guys versus the escort guys, bring out your kites, some razors on the tails, some rocks on the tails, and when you like somebody kite, you like it and you keep pulling, you know it can never unravel that way, and then you came to blows or words and we came across the road as friends. Kite flying then, sir, was an enjoyable activity, and I suspect it still is an enjoyable activity. Senator Brathwaite made me think just now. He had asked this question, he said he left the country and he came back and person started flying kites at night. I remember, sir, that we started flying kites, that they, sir, may have started flying kites at night in response to a particular development. This is in my area, I don't know if all across Barbados. I remember the civil aviation regulations would have restricted many persons and many communities, sir, from hoisting a kite at whatever height And the zone that was established would have been from Oistins to Boarded Hall in St. George to Six Roads and all the way back into South Point in Oistins. Quite a sizable zone, sir. And I remember around that time was perhaps the first time I took note of kites flying at night in my community, sir. Because some persons recognized that they couldn't fly kites in the community at all, and the time when they would be least seen would be at night or early in the morning, sir. And I'm not saying that it was any fault of the government, because government has to govern, and those regulations were very important in terms of flight safety. But in terms of my recollection of the time frame, I suspect in my area, it might have coincided in large measure with those particular regulations, sir. But I really also stand to commend this particular bill that we're discussing today and offer 3 solutions, sir. There's an undertone of solutions here which center around awareness. And we need to make persons more aware of the repercussions, sir. The repercussions of not adhering to the decency of acknowledging and appreciating others in the community and appreciating what your community is. I recently, sir, and I love my community, sir, had to go the route of establishing a no dumping sign on my front pasture, simply because one thing led to another. When one person, one morning, saw some breadfruit leaves on the pasture, literally next morning, I saw a tub, old TV, and one thing leads to another if you don't have that intervention, sir. And I'm not saying that it should always be individual intervention, and this is perhaps where the civics and ethics and the training comes into play, so that persons know that every spot in that community really and truthfully is a communal effort to keep it as tidy as possible. The other part, or the other recommendation to make, sir, really centers not around our national energy policy or energy plan or strategy or anything, but closely aligned to the electrification of certain sectors where they can be, where that electrification makes business sense as well. So for instance, as a person who owns over 20 weed whackers, I would say that there are many benefits. There are many benefits, sir, to using electrical weed whackers relative to the combustion engine weed whackers, the two-stroke engines as well. You can use them early on a morning, depending on the model, or if you want to rent one from someone, I can recommend. But you can use them early on morning, sir, and they would not wake anybody up based on how quiet they are. When the string hits the grass, obviously you have some peripheral noise, but it's not as noisy as an engine that's revving all the time. So I think electrification, particularly in the landscaping sector, which the National Conservation is aggressively pursuing a plan with respect to that. Within the transportation sector, sir, and we know about the vehicles, we know about the motorcycles that many persons would have mentioned today as well. Only to keep in mind, and I've always said this, that electrical cars, sir, present a double-edged sword for me, because whereas we in the Caribbean and some other countries may argue about the benefits of electrical cars, keeping in mind that it uses up to 8 or 9 times the amount of copper than a combustion engine vehicle uses, and we know copper is abundant in places like Chile, and if you see the devastation in terms of that mining sector, what it's causing to mine those particular minerals, it presents a double-edged sword for me. You know, it's like giving and taking, one plus and a huge minus as well. But nonetheless, electrification offers that immediate solution in many respects to the dampening of the noise that is caused as well, sir. And then the third thing is really the incentivization of the kite culture. As a result of the zone that I mentioned earlier, sir, many persons ventured into flying kites at nights, yes, but then those who were willing to adhere to the policy and understanding the communal benefit to not having the buzz in your ear at night, many of them did not possess the resources to go all the way, even down to take the family all the way down to the garrison, sir. And if through or establish maybe NGOs or government entities, we could provide incentives for them to participate down with the garrison. Some people may think it's a bit hard and fast, but transportation is an issue for some persons and some families on large measure. And that is the reason why many persons from Silver Sands don't go all the way down to the garrison to fly kites as well. But I think incentivizing it that way, promoting the kite flying competitions as well, ensuring that we can have workshops around the countries where persons know how to utilize, back in my day it would have been the flour and water, or the clammer-cherries to stick them together. And if you have glue, you can use glue. But I think having that frugal representation of what was before goes a very long way, sir. When I was thinking about all the comments made here, the one thing that I committed to myself, and perhaps if my wife is listening, I'll commit to her as well, that my child, has to know how to make a kite out of the same, not necessarily only trash bone. You mentioned trash bone, but there's also, Senator Braffett mentioned trash bone, but there's also the coconut stick, sir, using the coconut limbs as well. But I was thinking that she needs to have an appreciation for how to do these things from scratch, and if that could be incentivized through even our cultural entities as well, I would really love it, sir. I would really love it, sir. So, sir, with those few words, I end there by offering the solutions of broadening awareness, perhaps electrification in certain sectors where it does not impose on the business model of the entities, and also broadening the wide net of incentives that allow persons to appreciate what we have today in terms of kite flying, but what we had back in the days in terms of kite flying as well, sir. So those few words, I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Herod. Senator Haynes. Oh. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think I am heartened by all of the comments that have been made around the table, because it reflects that despite our challenges with civics and ethics and consideration and selflessness and sense of community, that those who at least sit around this table, who add their voices to the narrative of what has to constitute the thinking behind this country, are in fact on the same page and on the right course. I in particular take note of the comments made first by Senator Dr. Rogers. Those are important considerations, and certainly, as mentioned by others, the challenges with persons who later in life develop medical conditions as a result of noise pollution. That is a real challenge. I also take note of the points made by Senator Dr. Hines, and I want to just make the point here. I am reminded by a former Minister of Environment who sits in this room, in her current office, that in 2007, Barbados did have a national noise policy, and while there is no noise pollution legislation, that there are technical capacities that have been created, including a monitoring station right here in Bridgetown to monitor noise levels, decibels, counts, and so on. And I'm certain that many of us have heard from private sector entities and the NGO community specifically who've been talking about noise pollution, but also we are also familiar with the work being done by the Environmental Protection Department, which is actively involved in this space as well. But quite rightly, perhaps there may be an opportunity at this point for there to be a legislative role to be played. And truthfully, I take the points, of course, made by Senator Dr. Brathwaite. And it is true, our Prime Minister often reminds us that you cannot legislate culture, or you can't legislate change. And that is true. But we live in a society of laws because you can't force people to do the right things necessarily all the time in the absence of legislation. And there's so many things that we legislate. You have to have a driver's license in order to drive a vehicle. You have to be of a certain age in order to do certain things, largely because society does function on the basis of just that, laws. And so what we are hoping is that the balance of laws tilts in favor of personal and individual responsibility, and a sense of community, a sense of right and wrong, and a sense of ethical conscience as well, Mr. President. And so this legislation that we're navigating here today, and hopefully by the comments made by all around the table, can achieve broad consensus-driven support for the measures that are here. It does, in fact, at this point, Mr. President, speak to a legislative solution to an issue that really should have been driven by individual and personal responsibility and a sense of consideration for others. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. And thanks, the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate now dissolve itself into committee for further deliberation of this bill, and that Your Honour do now leave the chair.
The question is that I do now leave the chair. and the Honourable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 do now stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 3 stand part.
The question is that Clause 3 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 4 do now stand part.
The question is that Clause 4 do now stand part. Honourable senators in favour kindly say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. Senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do not
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Honourable senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the passing of one bill in committee that it be cited as the minor amendments. I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as a Minor Offences Amendment Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Minor Offences Amendment Act 2023. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that having now completed the business of the government for the day, that this Senate do now be adjourned, sine die.
The question is that this sitting of the Senate do not adjourn sine die. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. This sitting stands adjourned.